So tonight I'm going to give you a presentation on early uniform buttons. This really is something that came together after talking with Kevin Jones, and I would even say that he's really more of an expert on these than I am, but I've enjoyed looking at them and learning a little bit about them. So without any further ado, first I kind of want to give you the timeline for Mitch Reese's book. I would say this is a general rule timeline. We're going to discuss some of this as we go. But he says that in 1910, we started off with a button, and you'll see one in a minute, but it has a British Fleur-De-Lis. Okay, so just keep that in mind, British Fleur-De-Lis. And then it changed in 11 to an American Fleur-De-Lis. And then again in 14, it changed from having BS of A on it to just being the American Fleur-De-Lis. And it has Sigmund Eisner company markings. I'm not really going to get into sweet ore buttons in this presentation. They came out in around 32. But it should be noted he put 37 to 49 no manufacturer markings. I'm not really sure which ones these are. I really like the early Eisner buttons. So that's mainly what I've looked at. But we'll look at some unmarked buttons that to me are obviously Eisner buttons, which I don't think are the ones he's talking about here in the 37 to 49. He's talking about other buttons, but it just should be mentioned that there are earlier no manufacturer buttons, or that are not marked, than the 37 to 49 ones that are in his book later. Last, and this is something we'll discuss a little bit at length, is the Waterbury Button Company out of Connecticut. So it says 50s to 70. We'll get into all of them. It's very interesting how they actually tie in with the 1910 buttons and the other ones. So if you look at the right, that's a uniform I have. I just wanted to kind of show you. You've got 5 large buttons down the uniform and then 4 smaller ones on the pocket. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be showing the design of the larger buttons because it's easier to see. What I kind of took from my conversation with Kevin when we kind of compared stuff and we're looking, I think our guess is that anything that was made in one button or the other exists in both. We may not have it in our collection, but we think that if a design was made or a backing was made in a large button, it probably exists in a small, and if it was made in a small, it probably exists in a large. That is generally true, but some of them we're maybe missing one or we're missing the other, but we think that they were made. So first, let's look at the 1910 BS of A with the British Fleur-De-Lis. So you can see there's the British Fleur-De-Lis, be prepared. BS of A is in really nice relief on the button. I should note that you will find buttons in a variety of conditions. They were meant to be removed from the uniform when they were washed. So thinking back to that time period, you would literally put your uniform, you could literally put it through the wringer, which if you did while you had buttons on it, the buttons get all mashed up, which is why you find these buttons sometimes mashed up, because a lot of boys probably, if they were doing their own laundry, didn't want to go through the process of removing 9 buttons from their uniform every single time. So it's not that uncommon to find very worn buttons and to find them where they're kind of mashed up and disfigured looking and kind of hard to tell. It's hard to tell if they're a variety or not because they got mashed out or whatever. So in general, we've erred on the side of there's not many design differences on the front, because most of the things that you would say it was maybe a design difference is really more of a condition issue. Hope that makes sense. So these are the different 1910 buttons. Now, I say that 2 of these are pretty close. So the front is on the upper left, and then on the lower right is the larger blown up size of the back. So first you have an S. Eisner, Red Banks, New Jersey. Then you have one that is just an unmarked, there's no marking on it. just kind of a black back of a button. Now the last one, I think it's a larger font, and it says "and Co." So it says S. Eisner and Co., Red Banks, New Jersey, as opposed to just S. Eisner. So there's 3 different 1910 buttons. Now this could have been a 1 production run, 2 production run, 3 production run, or it could have been that they had a big hopper full of the backs of these, and as they were going through assembly, some of them got mixed and matched. We don't know. My best guess, and Michael is the expert on all of the early, Fleur-De-Lis and how it evolved, and he'll cover that in his own presentation later. But my rough understanding is that in late 1910, if you will, Boy Scouts of America actually started producing uniform insignia. They really didn't produce a lot, early 1910. So as the program started being developed, they started producing stuff. And then it was Dan Beard who came up with the Americanized Fleur-De-Lis later in 1911. So it would have been kind of spring/middle of 1911 before there would have been an American Fleur-De-Lis really to produce anything. So how long were these made? Well, they were certainly made, in my mind, into 1911. Were they issued all the way through 1911? I don't know. They could have been, only because they would have had a stock of them, and I don't think they would have gotten rid of them if they had them. They would have just issued them out. I know I have some certificates from the fall of 1911 that have a British Fleur-De-Lis on them, and that's just because they were leftover stock that they used up. So you can look at this as the 1910 button, but it's really also a 1911 button. Now the next button, so this is something that I learned recently. There are reproduction 1910 buttons. They're very nice quality. They're made by a company called Waterbury Buttons. They've been around since 1812. You can get them in all sorts of different finishes, and you can get them where the size on the back, from my or the size of the button, I guess, is a different size. So it'd be like the difference between the button going vertical on the uniform versus the pockets. But it's a really beautiful button. And this is a set that somebody, maybe the company, maybe someone had the company made up of these buttons. The fronts look really good. I mean, if you really wore them down some, got them dirty, washed them, messed them up, and put them on a uniform, it could trick somebody who didn't really know what they were looking for. There is more detail in the Fleur-De-Lis than the originals, but it's still a very good reproduction. The backs do say Waterbury, and you can see it's a company from Connecticut. So they actually had this sheet in with the reproduction set, and the thing in here that I thought was interesting, it says these brass buttons are restrikes from the original hand-carved steel dies of the original manufacturer. The manufacturer has been in business since 1812 and made buttons for many organizations and military units. The uniforms of General U.S. Grant and General Robert E. Lee had buttons made by this manufacturer, and it kind of goes on. So that would lead me to think that, and Waterbury has changed hands as a company. I did not do an in-depth research of the company, but I wondered, I was always under the impression that Sigmund Eisner made the early buttons, but then how did Waterbury get the original molds? Did Sigmund Eisner subcontract that out? I don't know. I'd love to learn more about that. Maybe someone on this meeting or someone else will have some additional information, or will feel like doing some additional research into Waterbury to understand how they got the original dies to the 1910 button. So the button that I don't have is the one that goes between 1910 and the one that would be used for a period of time from, in Mitch Reese's book, 1914 on. And in his book, he says that this button, the middle button, is from 11 to 13. To me, it is the rarest button of the different types of buttons, if that makes any sense. So you have the 10, you have this one, and then you have the one that you always see, the much more common one. This one is like the British one. It says BS of A, and it has a eagle on a fleur-de-lis instead of the British fleur-de-lis, okay? Something interesting, I saw one, and I wasn't able to get it, but I saw one, and it looked like to me the BS of A was in lower relief. I don't know why it looked that way. It could have been wear, but it did not look as crisp as the 1910 buttons for whatever reason. Just something I thought I'd mention. But that is certainly the rarest button, would be to have BS of A on an American fleur-de-lis button. And we know that it would have not been able to be made until late spring of 1911. And in my mind, my guess, if I had to make a guess, is that it was probably not made until maybe the summer or even the fall that it was actually produced and started being issued. And I think it may have only been issued for around a year, because you just never find them. You find 1910 buttons occasionally, and you can find them, but this button, to me at least, has been very elusive. So I think it was issued for a much shorter time than 11, 12, and 13. Now, the one in his book that says 1914 on, that I suspect came out in probably 13, is at least 13, maybe earlier, is just the plain American fleur-de-lis button. So I've got a couple varieties of these. This one here says no manufacturer's mark. It's kind of like that 1910 button. It's just a black base back. There's nothing really to it. The one that I think is really cool is this S. Eisner Red Bank, New Jersey, stamped Made in England. So that may be some more evidence that what could have happened is Eisner, when it was having the uniforms made, that the demand for the uniforms was outstripping their production capability or something, and maybe they were subcontracting out. I don't know. I've never heard of Eisner having a production plant in England that would have made buttons under their company name, but I don't know. This is something that's going to take some deep dive into the companies to try to understand where they were sourcing these buttons from. But the Made in England button, to me, was a new discovery a short while back, and I thought it was really cool. So there's 3 other varieties. You have S. Eisner Red Bank, New Jersey in small font, S. Eisner Red Bank, New Jersey in large font, a very distinct difference. And then you have it spelled out, Sigmund Eisner Company, Red Bank, New Jersey. Well, New Jersey's still abbreviated, but Sigmund is spelled out, where on all the other buttons it's just an S. Now, these are another reproduction from Waterbury. So you can see that they they have various tones on the back. One that's like a matte black, and one that's kind of a copper tone or something. You can order these on their site. They have a number of Boy Scout buttons. They have the 1910 American, button. They have this button. They have the 1910 British Fleur-de-Lis BS of A button. They have this button. They do not have, at least I did not see, an American BS of A, the American Fleur-de-Lis BS of A button. They didn't have that. But they do have a very early Canadian button, which may be interesting to some of our Canadian friends. They have a early Cubs BSA button, and they have a number of other more modern buttons that I think are the ones they made in the 50s through 1970. So I do suggest you go to Waterbury. I'll include a link in the description of the video if anybody needs it to make it a little easier when it eventually is on YouTube. But very interesting that they have these buttons that presumably you can still order all of them. They show up on their site. Now you have this. I'm not sure the real story behind this. It says Red Banks, New Jersey. It's very faint. It says S. Eisner. It looks like a Bakelite button. Um, I don't know when in particular it was used. It could have been for a leader jacket, or I'm not really sure. But the back mold part is very faint. Um, and I have pictures of a couple examples of these, and it seems that they're almost always very faint on the back. Now, this is a large button. This was for a leader's jacket. These are maybe a size and a half above the youth size button. Bit different, really nice quality, very nice big heavy button. But they were for the leader coats. Now, some alternative programs, if you ever get into button collecting, something you should keep an eye out for because they're kind of cool, are some of the alternative programs that ran parallel to Scouts in the early days. One of them is ABS, so American Boy Scouts. And here's two different examples of an ABS button. So you have one that's very similar to the two Boy Scout of America buttons with that black kind of just simple back. And then you have one that's kind of this silver tone. Some of that could be wear, I don't know. But I just thought that they would be kind of interesting. And that's it. I just really wanted to cover the early, really essentially the Eisner buttons, covering from 1910 up through the early 30s, covering the reproductions to let you know that they are out there. And if you have any interest in looking at some of the later buttons in the future, just let me know. Does anybody have any questions?
Rob Cutts mentioned I didn't see the BS of A on the first Americanized fleur-de-lis buttons.
Yeah, I don't have one. So this one, this example here, I put this here because I don't have one. And it would be between this, it would go to this. So the BS of A from the 1910 would be BS of A. It would be this same exact button on the right, but it would just say BS of A on it, just like the 1910 button. And they're very hard. I mean, I don't know how many 1910 buttons I've had. I've had probably large or small. I've had probably 15 maybe over the last couple years. And I've never had an American Fleur-de-Lis button with a BS of A, which is why I feel like they were made. I think that the 1910 button was made a little longer, and I think that the one that was a really short run of production was the American Fleur-de-Lis with BS of A, and then they went ahead and switched a little earlier than most people think into the American Fleur-de-Lis with no lettering, that one.
And Larry, in your opinion, it's not unusual for people to replace buttons to make a jacket look more valuable. Is that true or not?
Yeah, it's very common for people to move buttons around. And I'll be honest, I've seen multiple times where somebody made a 1910 uniform available and you look at it and it has 1910 buttons on it and they all beautiful color match, they look great. And then you look at the inside of the uniform and the seals that are on the inside of the uniform are the American Fleur-de-Lis, which didn't come out till later. So it's impossible. You can't have a 1910 uniform that's a true 1910 uniform, which is how they're often advertised, with British Fleur-de-Lis buttons, but then seals on the inside of it that are American Fleur-de-Lis seals printed on the inside. So that's just something to keep an eye out for.
Is it possible, particularly when you're dealing with buttons like this that are easily removed, is it possible that somebody with an early uniform, having lost 2 or 3 of them, mom said, no, just buy a new set?
Well, you could. I don't know. That's a good question, I guess, in the catalog, how they would have been advertised and how you would have ordered them. They were probably not sold as a set. Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I would have thought that they would have been sold as singles, as replacement buttons.
Well, I think they probably were, but I mean, rather than have mismatched buttons.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's certainly possible, and a lot of these buttons, a lot of them that you get are very worn. They just did not hold up well to being washed and wrung out, and so it's entirely possible that a lot of the earlier buttons were discarded and replaced with later buttons. That is absolutely possible. And Kevin just commented that replacement buttons were sold as sets, so that's interesting.